The early morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Staff Sergeant David Thompson adjusted his dress blue uniform one final time. Every crease was perfect, every medal positioned exactly where it should be. The bronze star on his chest caught the light as he walked toward the imposing building that housed the county court system. Today wasn't about him, though. Today was about family. His younger brother Jake had called him 3 weeks ago, voice shaking with worry and shame. A simple night out with friends had turned into a nightmare when a disagreement at Murphy's bar escalated into something much worse. Jake wasn't a fighter by nature, but when someone started saying horrible things about their sister, his temper got the better of him. One punch led to another, and before anyone knew what was happening, the police were involved and Jake was facing assault charges. David had been in the middle of training exercises at the naval base when the call came through. He remembered dropping everything and driving 4 hours straight to see his brother in lockup. Jake looked so young sitting behind that glass partition, barely 22 and scared out of his mind. The public defender was overworked and had already suggested taking a plea deal, but David knew his brother better than that. Jake made a mistake, sure, but he wasn't a criminal. That's why David was here this morning, wearing his full dress uniform and carrying a folder full of character references. When a Navy SEAL speaks up for someone in court, judges tend to listen. David had seen too many good men destroyed by bad decisions to let his brother go down without a fight. Jake was studying to be a teacher, volunteered at the local animal shelter, and had never been in trouble before that night. One moment of poor judgment shouldn't define the rest of his life. The courthouse was already busy despite the early hour. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past with briefcases and serious expressions. Families clustered together on benches, whispering nervously about upcoming hearings. Security guards checked bags and waved metal detector wands with practiced efficiency. David had been in war zones that felt more welcoming than this place, but he understood the necessity of it all. He found the directory near the main entrance and located courtroom 3, where Jake's hearing was scheduled. The hallway outside was lined with wooden benches that had seen better days, their surfaces worn smooth by countless worried family members and nervous defendants. David chose a spot with a clear view of both the courtroom door and the main hallway, old habits from his military training making him automatically aware of his surroundings. Checking his watch, David realized he had arrived almost 40 minutes early. Punctuality was drilled into every service member from day one, but this morning he had driven even faster than usual. Sleep hadn't come easily the night before, his mind running through everything he wanted to say to the judge. How do you explain to a civilian that the young man who threw that punch was the same kid who used to rescue injured birds and nurse them back to health? How do you make someone understand that one night doesn't erase 22 years of good character? David pulled out his phone to send Jake a quick text message. His brother was probably awake already, too nervous to sleep much. The reply came back almost instantly, just 2 words. Thank you. David smiled slightly, remembering all the times he had protected his little brother over the years. From playground bullies to broken hearts, David had always been there. Today would be no different. The courthouse was filling up now as the morning progressed. David watched the steady stream of people walking past, each carrying their own burdens and worries. A young mother clutched a toddler while juggling paperwork, probably here for a custody hearing. An elderly man in an ill-fitting suit sat alone on a bench across the hall, staring at the floor with the weight of the world on his shoulders. A group of teenagers whispered nervously near the elevator, their parents looking even more anxious than they did. David had always been good at reading people, a skill that had served him well in the military. You learn to assess threats quickly when your life depends on it, and you develop an instinct for separating the dangerous from the merely desperate. Most of the people here today fell into the latter category, ordinary citizens caught up in the complex machinery of the justice system. His phone buzzed with another message, this time from his commanding officer. Lieutenant Colonel Williams had given David permission to attend the hearing and had even offered to write a letter of recommendation for Jake. The military took care of its own. and by extension their families. David had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, participated in classified operations he could never discuss, and earned commendations for valor under fire. His word carried weight, and everyone knew it. As David sat there reviewing his notes one more time, he became aware that people were glancing at his uniform. Some looked with obvious respect, nodding politely or even approaching to thank him for his service. Others seemed curious, perhaps wondering what a Navy SEAL was doing in a civilian courthouse. A few appeared uncomfortable, though David couldn't tell if it was because of the military connection or something else entirely. The dress blue uniform commanded attention wherever he wore it. David had earned every ribbon, every medal, every insignia through years of dedication and sacrifice. The Bronze Star had come after a particularly difficult mission where he had risked his own life to save 2 wounded Marines. The Purple Heart was from a roadside bomb that had left him with shrapnel scars he still carried. Each decoration told a story of service, courage, and commitment to something bigger than himself. David's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Jake, calling from the holding area where defendants waited before their hearings. His voice was tight with nerves. But David could hear the relief when he confirmed he was already at the courthouse. They talked for a few minutes about what to expect, with David offering reassurance and reminding his brother to stay calm and speak clearly when addressed by the judge. After ending the call, David noticed a police officer walking down the hallway in his direction. The man was older, maybe mid-40s, with graying hair and a somewhat rumpled uniform. His name tag read Morrison, and something about his body language immediately caught David's attention. The officer's gaze was fixed directly on him, and his expression was anything but friendly. David had dealt with law enforcement many times in his military career, usually in cooperative situations involving base security or joint operations. He respected the job police officers did and understood the challenges they faced every day. But as Officer Morrison approached, David sensed this encounter might be different from those professional interactions. The officer stopped directly in front of David's bench, close enough that other people in the hallway began to take notice. Morrison's eyes moved slowly over David's uniform, taking in every detail with obvious skepticism. His posture was aggressive, confrontational, like a predator sizing up potential prey. David remained seated but alert, his military training automatically assessing the situation. Something was about to happen. David could feel it in the tension that suddenly filled the air around them. The normal courthouse bustle seemed to fade into the background as Morrison continued his silent examination. Other people were starting to stare now, sensing the brewing confrontation even if they didn't understand what was causing it. David took a deep breath and prepared himself for whatever was coming next. He had faced enemy combatants in foreign countries, survived attacks that killed better men than him, and earned his place among the most elite soldiers in the world. But somehow, sitting in this American courthouse in his dress uniform, he felt more vulnerable than he had in any combat zone. The morning that had started with hope and determination was about to take a very different turn. Officer Morrison's boots clicked against the marble floor as he came to a stop right in front of David's bench. The sound echoed through the courthouse hallway, making several people look up from their conversations. David remained seated, his hands resting calmly on his knees, but every muscle in his body was now alert. Years of military training had taught him to recognize when a situation was about to go sideways, and every instinct was telling him that this moment was one of those times. Morrison crossed his arms and stared down at David with undisguised contempt. His eyes moved slowly from the polished dress shoes to the perfectly pressed uniform pants, up to the ribbons and medals adorning David's chest, and finally to his face. The silence stretched for several uncomfortable seconds while other courthouse visitors began to notice the tension building between the two men. "Well, well, well, well," Morrison finally said, his voice loud enough to carry down the hallway. "What do we have here? Halloween's not for another few months, kid." He let out a harsh laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. "Where'd you get that costume? Amazon? eBay? Or did you raid your grandfather's closet?" David felt his jaw tighten at the word costume, but he kept his expression neutral. He dealt with skeptics before, people who couldn't believe someone like him belonged in special forces. Usually a simple explanation and his military ID were enough to clear up any confusion. This felt different, though. There was something personal in Morrison's tone, something that went beyond simple doubt about his credentials. "Good morning, officer," David replied calmly, his voice respectful but firm. "I'm Staff Sergeant David Thompson, United States Navy. I'm here for a court hearing this morning." He spoke clearly, making sure his words carried to the growing number of people who were now watching the exchange with obvious interest. Morrison's face twisted into an ugly smirk. "Staff Sergeant, Navy SEAL?" He shook his head dramatically as if he'd just heard the most ridiculous joke in the world. "Right, and I'm the Secretary of Defense. You kids today, I swear. Think you can just put on a uniform and everybody's supposed to bow down and thank you for your service?" The accusation hit David like a physical blow. Stolen valor was one of the most serious accusations you could make against a service member, and Morrison was making it loudly and publicly. David could feel the eyes of everyone in the hallway on him now, watching to see how he would respond. Some faces showed confusion, others curiosity, and a few displayed the kind of suspicion that Morrison's words were designed to plant. David reached slowly for his wallet, making sure his movements were deliberate and non-threatening. "Sir, I'd be happy to show you my military identification card. I can also provide my commanding officer's contact information if you'd like to verify my service record." His voice remained steady, professional, the same tone he used when briefing superior officers or addressing his own men. "Oh, I bet you've got some fake ID too," Morrison said, taking a step closer to David's bench. "Probably bought the whole package online. Uniform, medals, fake paperwork, the works. You people are all the same, always trying to pretend you're something you're not." The phrase, "you people," hung in the air like a slap. David had heard those words before, understood exactly what Morrison meant by them, and knew this confrontation had very little to do with questioning his military credentials. This was about something much deeper, much uglier, and much more dangerous. A young woman sitting nearby with her small daughter looked uncomfortable and gathered her things to move to a different bench. An elderly man who had been reading a newspaper lowered it and watched the scene with growing concern. Two lawyers stopped their conversation and turned to see what was causing the disturbance. The normal courthouse atmosphere was shifting, becoming charged with tension and uncertainty. David stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame bringing him to eye level with Morrison. He kept his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, but his presence was unmistakably commanding. 3 tours in Afghanistan had given him a quiet confidence that couldn't be faked, the kind of bearing that came from leading men in life or death situations. "Officer Morrison," David said, reading the name tag on the man's uniform, "I understand you have concerns about my identity. I'm prepared to provide any documentation you need to verify my service. But I'd appreciate it if you could speak to me with the same respect you'd show any other member of the armed forces." Morrison's face flushed red at being addressed by name. "Respect? You want respect?" His voice was getting louder now, drawing even more attention from passers-by. "How about you try earning it instead of stealing it? How about you get a real job instead of playing dress-up and hoping people will buy you drinks and thank you for your service?" David felt heat rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was exactly what Morrison wanted, a reaction he could use to justify whatever he was planning to do next. David had seen this playbook before, the way some people tried to provoke service members into losing their temper so they could paint them as unstable or dangerous. "Sir, I'm not looking for any special treatment," David replied evenly. "I'm just here to support my brother at his hearing. I don't want any trouble with you or anyone else." He gestured toward the courtroom door. "The hearing starts in 20 minutes, and I'd like to review my notes before then." But Morrison wasn't finished. If anything, David's calm responses seemed to make him angrier. "Your brother? Let me guess, he's in trouble too, right? Probably drugs, theft, assault? That's what happens in families like yours." One bad apple spoils the whole bunch, and the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The racist implications were clear now, no longer hidden behind questions about stolen valor or fake uniforms. Morrison was making assumptions about David's family, based purely on the color of his skin, and he was doing it loudly enough for half the courthouse to hear. David's hands clenched involuntarily at his sides, but he kept them visible and controlled. An older black woman sitting across the hallway shook her head in disgust and pulled out her cell phone. A middle-aged white man in a business suit stopped, walking, and turned to watch, his expression showing clear disapproval of Morrison's behavior. Two young lawyers, one Hispanic and one Asian, had moved closer to get a better view of what was happening, their faces reflecting the same shock and anger that David was feeling. "Officer, I think you're making some assumptions that aren't based on facts," David said, his military training helping him maintain his composure despite the personal nature of the attacks. "My brother is a good person who made a mistake. That's why we have a court system, to determine the facts and ensure justice is served fairly." Morrison stepped even closer now, invading David's personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Justice? Fair? That's rich, coming from someone who's committing a federal crime by impersonating a service member. Real SEALs don't look like you, pal. And they sure don't come from neighborhoods like the one you crawled out of." The courthouse security guard at the main entrance had noticed the commotion and was walking in their direction, though he seemed uncertain about whether to intervene. A court clerk emerged from one of the nearby offices, drawn by the raised voices and obvious tension. Even the elevator had stopped bringing new visitors as people chose to take the stairs. Rather than walk through the increasingly hostile scene, David realized that Morrison was deliberately escalating the situation, trying to provoke a reaction that would justify more aggressive action. The officer's hand was resting on his radio now, ready to call for backup the moment David gave him any excuse. This wasn't a random encounter or a case of mistaken identity. This was a carefully orchestrated attempt to humiliate and intimidate him in the most public way possible. "Sir, I'm going to sit back down now and wait for my brother's hearing," David said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding respect in the world's most elite military unit. "I suggest you continue with whatever business brought you to the courthouse today." But as David turned toward his bench, Morrison's hand shot out and grabbed his arm roughly, fingers digging into the fabric of his dress uniform. "I didn't say you could move, boy. When a police officer is talking to you, you stand there and you listen. And you show some respect while you're at it." The word "boy" cut through the air like a knife, and suddenly every person in the hallway understood exactly what this confrontation was really about. This wasn't about stolen valor or fake uniforms or questionable credentials. This was about a racist police officer who couldn't stand the sight of a black man in a Navy SEAL uniform, couldn't accept that someone who looked like David could have earned the right to wear those medals and ribbons. David looked down at Morrison's hand gripping his arm, then back up at the officer's face. His voice was deadly quiet when he spoke, the kind of tone that made hardened Marines straighten up and pay attention. "Sir, I need you to remove your hand from me right now." The hallway fell silent except for the distant sound of voices from other parts of the courthouse. Everyone was watching now, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Cell phones were appearing in hands as people instinctively knew they might need to document whatever happened next. Morrison's grip on David's arm tightened like a vice, his knuckles white with the effort. The fabric of David's dress uniform bunched under the officer's fingers as he pulled David closer, close enough that David could smell the stale coffee on his breath and see the veins bulging in his neck. The courthouse hallway had gone completely silent now, as if everyone was holding their breath waiting to see what would happen next. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Morrison hissed, his voice low but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "Walking around in that fancy uniform, acting like you own the place? Well, let me tell you something. Boy, I've been keeping the peace in this town for 15 years while you were probably running around causing trouble in whatever ghetto you came from." David felt every muscle in his body tense at the word ghetto, but he forced himself to remain perfectly still. Years of training had taught him that the most dangerous moments were often the quietest ones, when everything balanced on a knife's edge between control and chaos. One wrong move, one heated word, and this situation would explode in ways that could destroy everything he'd worked for. "Officer Morrison, you're hurting me," David said clearly, making sure his voice carried to the growing crowd of witnesses. "I need you to let go of my arm right now. I haven't done anything wrong, and you have no legal right to detain me." But Morrison wasn't listening to reason anymore. Something had snapped inside him, some deep-seated anger that went far beyond anything David had said or done. His free hand moved to his utility belt, fingers dancing over the various tools of his trade: handcuffs, pepper spray, baton, and the service weapon that David was trying very hard not to think about. "Legal, right?" Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that made several people in the hallway step backward. "I'm a police officer, and you're a suspect in multiple crimes. Stolen valor, impersonating a federal officer, probably drug possession too. You people always have drugs on you. That's enough legal right for me." The phrase, "you people again," spoken with such casual venom that it made David's skin crawl. Around them, the courthouse crowd was getting larger as word spread that something serious was happening. A security guard was speaking urgently into his radio. 2 court clerks had emerged from their offices. Even a few lawyers had stopped their morning preparations to watch the unfolding drama. David noticed phones coming out, people starting to record what they were seeing. Part of him was grateful for that. If this went bad, at least there would be evidence of how it really started. But another part of him worried about what those videos might show if he was forced to defend himself. How would it look to see a Navy SEAL, trained in combat and deadly force, in a physical confrontation with a police officer? "Sir, there are a lot of people watching right now," David said quietly, hoping that Morrison would realize how this looked to the crowd of witnesses. "Maybe we should both take a step back and handle this calmly. I don't want anyone to get hurt, and I'm sure you don't either." Morrison's response was to dig his fingers even deeper into David's arm, hard enough that David knew there would be bruises later. "The only one who's going to get hurt here is you if you don't start showing some respect. Now turn around and put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest." "For what?" David asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "What crime do you think I've committed?" "Stolen valor is a federal offense," Morrison snarled. "Impersonating a military officer, public intoxication, resisting arrest, assault on a police officer." His voice was getting louder with each accusation, as if saying them more forcefully would make them true. David almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Public intoxication? He hadn't had a drink in 6 months. Assault on a police officer? He hadn't so much as raised his voice, let alone touched Morrison. The man was making up charges as he went along, trying to find something that would stick. "Officer, I haven't been drinking, I haven't assaulted anyone. And I'm not resisting arrest because I'm not under arrest?" David said, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel creeping in. "You're the one who approached me. You're the one who grabbed me. I've done nothing but sit on this bench and wait for my brother's court hearing." Morrison's face was turning red now, a deep crimson that made David wonder if the man might actually have a stroke right there in the courthouse hallway. "Don't you dare tell me what I saw," he spat. "I saw you acting suspicious, probably casing the joint for your gang buddies. I saw you get aggressive when I asked you simple questions, and I saw you resist when I tried to detain you." The word gang hit David like a physical blow. Here he was, a decorated Navy SEAL who had risked his life defending the country, being accused of being in a gang simply because of the color of his skin. The injustice of it, the sheer stupidity of it, made his vision blur with anger for just a moment before his training reasserted itself. A middle-aged woman in a business suit had moved closer to the scene, her phone held high as she recorded everything. "I've been watching since this started," she called out loudly. "That young man hasn't done anything wrong." "The officer is the one being aggressive." Morrison whipped his head around to glare at her. Ma'am, I need you to step back and stop interfering with police business. This man is a suspected criminal, and recording this incident could compromise an ongoing investigation. What investigation? The woman shot back. You walked up to him while he was sitting quietly on a bench. I saw the whole thing. He's been nothing but polite and respectful, and you've been nothing but hostile and inappropriate. Other voices began joining hers. An elderly man with a cane spoke up. She's right. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes, and that boy in uniform hasn't bothered anybody. You're the one causing problems, officer. A young father holding his toddler's hand added, My kid was getting scared by all the yelling. This is a courthouse, not a battleground. People are trying to handle their legal business in peace. Morrison's head swiveled from person to person as the crowd turned against him, their voices growing more confident as they realized they outnumbered him. His grip on David's arm loosened slightly, but his other hand moved closer to his weapon. David could see the man's mind racing, trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that was slipping away from him. All of you need to back off right now, Morrison shouted, his voice echoing off the marble walls. This is a police matter, and civilians need to stay out of it. Anyone who interferes will be arrested for obstruction of justice. But the crowd wasn't backing down. If anything, Morrison's threats seemed to make them angrier. A young lawyer in an expensive suit stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to arguing in court. Officer, I'm an attorney, and I can tell you right now that you have no legal basis for detaining this man. He's done nothing that constitutes a crime, and your behavior is bordering on harassment and assault. I strongly suggest you release him immediately and walk away before this gets any worse. Morrison's face went from red to purple. Are you threatening me, counselor? Because threatening a police officer is a crime too. Maybe you'd like to join your friend here in lockup. David could feel the situation spiraling completely out of control now. Morrison was cornered, embarrassed, and angry, which made him infinitely more dangerous. The crowd was getting larger and more vocal, which would only make Morrison feel more threatened. And somewhere in the middle of it all was David himself, still being gripped by a man who seemed determined to find a reason to use force. Officer. Morrison, David said, trying one more time to de-escalate, I think we both want this to end peacefully. Why don't you let go of my arm and we can talk about whatever concerns you have like reasonable adults? Morrison's response was to suddenly twist David's arm behind his back, trying to force him into a position where handcuffs could be applied. I told you to put your hands behind your back, he snarled. Stop resisting and maybe this won't get worse for you. That's when David's training kicked in, not his training to follow orders, but his training to survive when someone was trying to hurt him. Morrison was using excessive force based on nothing but prejudice and manufactured charges. The officer was clearly not thinking rationally anymore, and David realized that his own safety was now at risk. The crowd gasped as Morrison attempted to wrench David's arm into an arrest position. Several people shouted for him to stop. The security guard was running toward them now, speaking urgently into his radio for backup. And David found himself at the moment he'd been dreading since this whole thing started, the moment where he would have to choose between submission to injustice and defending himself against an armed police officer who seemed determined to escalate this encounter no matter what David said or did. The next few seconds would change everything for both men, and everyone in that courthouse hallway knew it. The moment Morrison tried to force David's arm behind his back, every instinct that had kept David alive through 3 combat tours kicked into high gear. Time seemed to slow down as his mind automatically assessed the threat level, calculated his options, and prepared his body to respond. This wasn't Afghanistan, but the danger was just as real. Morrison was stronger than he looked, and his position as a police officer gave him both physical leverage and legal authority that made resistance complicated. But David had been trained by the best fighters in the world, men who understood that sometimes survival meant making split-second decisions that others might not understand. In one fluid motion, David broke Morrison's grip using a technique he'd learned in close-quarters combat training. He didn't strike back, didn't escalate the violence. but simply freed himself from the officer's grasp with the kind of precision that only came from years of elite military training. Morrison stumbled backward, shocked that his attempt to force David into submission had failed so completely. The courthouse hallway erupted in gasps and shouts, as witnesses realized they had just seen something extraordinary. David immediately raised his hands, palms visible, stepping back to create distance between himself and Morrison. His voice was calm but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I have not attacked anyone," David announced clearly. This officer grabbed me without legal justification, and I defended myself using minimal force. I'm not resisting arrest because I have not committed any crime, but Morrison wasn't thinking clearly anymore. The humiliation of being outmaneuvered by someone he'd been trying to intimidate, combined with the growing crowd of witnesses who had clearly seen what really happened, sent him into a complete panic. He scrambled backward on the marble floor, one hand reaching for his radio while the other went to his service weapon. "He's attacking me!" Morrison screamed, his voice echoing off the courthouse walls. "Suspect is assaulting a police officer. I need backup. I need backup right now." The crowd of witnesses couldn't believe what they were seeing. The middle-aged woman who had been recording the encounter stepped forward, her phone still capturing everything. "That's a lie!" she shouted. "The officer grabbed him first. We all saw it. The soldier was defending himself." Her words were immediately supported by a chorus of other voices. The elderly man with the cane was shaking his head in disgust. "That young man didn't attack anybody. He was just trying to get away from someone who was hurting him." A businessman in an expensive suit was already dialing his phone. "I'm calling the news stations," he announced loudly. "People need to see this. This is exactly the kind of police behavior that needs to be exposed." Morrison's panic was growing by the second. His radio calls were bringing backup, but the crowd was getting more vocal in their support of David. People were taking pictures and videos from every angle. Security guards were running toward the scene. This was turning into a public relations disaster of epic proportions. "He's got military training," Morrison yelled into his radio, still pointing at David with a shaking hand. "He could be carrying weapons. He's extremely dangerous. All units respond to the courthouse immediately." David kept his hands raised and his voice steady even as he saw Morrison's hand moving toward his weapon. "Officer Morrison, I am not armed, and I am not a threat to you or anyone else. I'm asking you to please calm down and think about what you're doing." But Morrison was beyond reason now. The racist assumptions that had started this whole encounter were combining with his embarrassment at being outmaneuvered, creating a toxic mixture of rage and panic that was making him increasingly dangerous. "Don't you tell me to calm down?" Morrison screamed. "You attacked a police officer. That's a felony. You're going to prison for the rest of your life." A young lawyer who had been waiting for her own court hearing stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone trained in legal procedures. "Officer, what you're describing is not what anyone here witnessed. This man defended himself against an unlawful detention. You had no probable cause to arrest him, and you used excessive force when he questioned your authority." Morrison whipped his head around to glare at her. "Stay out of this, lady. This is police business, not some courtroom debate. I don't need a law degree to know when someone's resisting arrest." "But you do need probable cause to make an arrest in the first place," the lawyer shot back. "And questioning someone's military service without evidence isn't probable cause. Neither is grabbing someone because you don't like the way they look." The truth of her words hit Morrison like a slap. He looked around the hallway at the growing crowd of witnesses, all of whom had seen exactly how this encounter had started. His radio was crackling with responses from other units, asking for details about the situation. Soon, this hallway would be full of police officers, and Morrison would have to explain why he had escalated a simple conversation into a physical confrontation. David could see the panic in Morrison's eyes and realized the man was about to do something desperate. Years of combat experience had taught him to recognize when someone was cornered and dangerous, and Morrison was definitely both. "Officer, I know you're upset," David said. using the same calm tone he'd used to talk down panicked civilians in war zones. But right now, we have an opportunity to end this peacefully. Nobody has to get hurt here. Morrison's response was to pull out his service weapon. Though he didn't point it directly at David, the sight of the gun caused several people in the crowd to scream and move backward, creating a circle of empty space around the two men. "Everyone stay back," Morrison shouted, his voice cracking with stress. "This suspect has military training and should be considered extremely dangerous. He attacked me without provocation." The courthouse security guard finally reached the scene, breathing hard from his sprint across the building. He immediately got on his own radio, calling for additional security and requesting that someone contact the building administrator. This was way beyond anything he was trained to handle. David remained perfectly still, acutely aware that one wrong move could turn this into a tragedy. Morrison's weapon wasn't pointed at him yet, but it could be in a fraction of a second. The crowd of witnesses was getting larger and more agitated. Security cameras were recording everything. This was exactly the kind of situation that could destroy lives and careers in an instant. "Sir, I'm going to very slowly reach for my military identification," David said, speaking clearly so everyone could hear. "I want to show you proof of my service so we can clear up this misunderstanding." "Don't move," Morrison screamed, now pointing his weapon directly at David. "Keep your hands where I can see them. Any sudden movement and I'll consider it a threat." The crowd gasped collectively at the sight of a police officer pointing a gun at an unarmed man in military dress uniform. Several people were openly crying now. Others were shouting for Morrison to put his weapon down. The young lawyer was speaking rapidly into her phone, probably calling 911 or maybe the FBI. David had been in situations like this before, but never as a civilian in his own country. In Afghanistan, the rules of engagement were clear. Here, in a courthouse hallway surrounded by innocent people, the stakes were completely different. One trigger pull could end his life, destroy his family, and traumatize everyone watching. The sound of sirens was getting closer now as more police units responded to Morrison's call. Soon, this hallway would be full of armed officers who would have to make sense of a chaotic situation based on the word of a fellow cop, who was clearly not thinking straight. David closed his eyes for just a moment, thinking about his brother, Jake, waiting in lockup for a hearing that might never happen now. He thought about his parents who had sacrificed so much to give their children a better life. He thought about the men he'd served with in Afghanistan, some of whom had died defending the very principles that Morrison was violating. When he opened his eyes, David's voice was steady and clear. "Officer Morrison, I'm going to ask you one more time to lower your weapon. You're pointing a gun at a decorated Navy SEAL in front of dozens of witnesses. This is not going to end well for either of us if you don't calm down right now." The courthouse fell silent except for the distant sound of approaching sirens. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see whether this confrontation would end in tragedy or if somehow, some way, both men would walk away from this alive. The courthouse had never seen anything like it. What started as a simple confrontation between two men had exploded into complete chaos, with police officers, security guards, and curious onlookers all converging on the hallway outside courtroom 3. The sound of boots on marble echoed through the building as more officers responded to Morrison's frantic radio calls, their heavy equipment jangling with each hurried step. David stood perfectly still in the center of it all, his hands raised and visible, trying to project calm in a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. Morrison was on the ground a few feet away, clutching his shoulder and screaming at the top of his lungs about being attacked by a terrorist. The word hung in the air like poison, adding another layer of danger to an already explosive situation. "He's got military training," Morrison was shouting to anyone who would listen. "He could be carrying weapons. He's extremely dangerous." His voice cracked with panic and rage as he pointed at David with his uninjured arm. "I need backup." "I need backup. Right now?" The first officers to arrive on scene drew their weapons immediately, not understanding what had happened, but responding to Morrison's claims that he'd been assaulted. David found himself staring down the barrels of 3 service pistols held by nervous cops who were getting their information from a man who was clearly not thinking straight. "Officers, please listen to me," David said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I have not attacked anyone. I defended myself when Officer Morrison tried to unlawfully arrest me. Everything he's saying is a lie, and there are dozens of witnesses who saw what really happened." But the arriving officers weren't interested in witness statements right now. They were focused on the immediate threat assessment, and a man with military training was at the top of their concern list. "Get on the ground," one of them shouted. "Face down, hands behind your head." "I will comply with your orders," David replied calmly, "but I want everyone here to know that I am not resisting and I have not committed any crimes." He slowly began to lower himself toward the floor, moving deliberately so no one would mistake his actions for aggressive behavior. That's when the crowd erupted. "Don't you dare!" shouted the middle-aged woman who had been recording the whole encounter. "That man did nothing wrong. We all saw it. The officer attacked him first. This is ridiculous," called out the elderly man with the cane. "You're arresting the wrong person. That boy in uniform was just sitting on a bench minding his own business." More voices joined in, a chorus of anger and disbelief that grew louder with each passing second. The lawyer who had tried to intervene earlier was now speaking rapidly into his phone, probably calling his office or maybe the media. Court clerks were emerging from their offices to see what all the commotion was about. Even the judges were starting to take notice. With several appearing in their doorways to assess the situation, the lead officer looked confused and overwhelmed. He'd responded to a call about an assault on a police officer, expecting to find a clear-cut situation. Instead, he found a courthouse full of angry witnesses defending the supposed attacker and claiming that Morrison was the real problem. "Ma'am, I need you to step back," he told the woman with the phone. "This is a crime scene, and you're interfering with our investigation." "Crime scene?" she shot back, her voice rising with indignation. "The only crime I saw was a racist cop harassing a Navy SEAL for no reason. I've got the whole thing on video, and I'm sending it to every news station in the state." Morrison struggled to his feet, still holding his shoulder but determined to regain control of the narrative. "Don't listen to them," he pleaded with his fellow officers. "They're all lying. That man is dangerous. He attacked me without provocation." But even as Morrison spoke, more people were adding their voices to David's defense. A young mother, who had been waiting for her own court hearing, stepped forward. Officer Morrison grabbed that soldier's arm first. "I saw it with my own eyes." The soldier tried to get away peacefully, and Morrison wouldn't let him go. A businessman in an expensive suit nodded vigorously. That's exactly what happened. The officer was being completely inappropriate from the very beginning. He made racist comments and accusations without any basis in fact. The security guard who had been watching from the main entrance finally reached the scene, breathing hard from his run across the courthouse. "I saw the whole thing on the security cameras," he announced, still catching his breath. "Everything these people are saying is true. Officer Morrison was the aggressor from start to finish." The lead officer's radio crackled with more calls. Apparently, someone had already contacted the media, and news vans were starting to arrive. Outside the courthouse, the district attorney's office was asking for updates. The courthouse administration wanted to know why their building was filled with armed police officers. This was turning into a public relations nightmare for everyone involved. Morrison's panic was becoming more obvious by the minute. "You don't understand," he insisted to anyone who would listen. "I've been a cop for 15 years. I know a criminal when I see one. That man is not a real Navy SEAL. Real SEALs don't look like that. They don't act like that." The racist implications of his words weren't lost on anyone present. Several people in the crowd made disgusted sounds, and the businessman who had witnessed the encounter shook his head in obvious disbelief. "What exactly is a real SEAL supposed to look like?" asked a young black woman who had been waiting for a family court hearing. Her voice was sharp with anger. "Because from where I'm standing, that man looks exactly like what a hero should look like." Morrison's face flushed red again. You people don't understand. There are procedures, protocols. When someone is impersonating a military officer, it's my duty as a law enforcement officer to investigate. He showed you his military ID, the lawyer called out. You refused to look at it. You made up your mind about him the second you saw him, and nothing he could have said or done would have changed that. The crowd was getting bigger now as word spread through the courthouse that something major was happening. People were abandoning their own legal proceedings to come see what all the fuss was about. The hallway was becoming dangerously crowded, and the officers were starting to look nervous about crowd control. That's when everyone heard the distinctive sound of military vehicles pulling up outside. Through the tall courthouse windows, David could see the olive-drab colors of MP vehicles and the sharp uniforms of military police officers. Someone had called the base, and his commanding officers were on their way. Morrison's face went white when he saw the military police through the window. They're here to arrest him too, he said weakly, but his voice lacked conviction now. He was starting to realize that military police don't show up to arrest their own soldiers unless something very serious has happened. The courthouse doors burst open, and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez walked in first, his bearing unmistakably military, and his expression deadly serious. Behind him came Lieutenant Colonel Williams, David's commanding officer, still wearing his CUs from the morning training exercises. The civilian officers instinctively stepped aside as the military personnel entered the building. "What's the situation here?" Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge of chaotic situations. His eyes quickly scanned the scene, taking in the drawn weapons, the crowd of agitated civilians, and David still kneeling on the floor with his hands visible. Morrison tried to reassert control of the situation. "Military police need to stay back. This man assaulted me and is impersonating one of your soldiers. He's dangerous and probably under the influence of something." Lieutenant Colonel Williams stepped forward, his rank insignia clearly visible on his uniform. "Officer, I'm going to need you to lower your accusations. Staff Sergeant Thompson is one of my men, and I can personally vouch for his identity, his character, and his service record." "You don't understand," Morrison insisted, his voice getting higher and more desperate. "He attacked me. I was just doing my job, investigating suspicious behavior, and he assaulted a police officer." Rodriguez pulled out his phone and showed Morrison a photograph. It was David receiving a commendation from a Navy admiral, clearly showing his face and rank. "This is Staff Sergeant Thompson receiving recognition for valor in Afghanistan," Rodriguez said calmly. "I was there when it happened." "So, unless you think the entire United States Navy is part of some elaborate conspiracy, I suggest you reconsider your position." The courthouse crowd erupted in cheers and applause. People were clapping and shouting support for David, vindicated now that his military credentials had been confirmed by his own commanding officers. Morrison looked around desperately, realizing that his credibility was evaporating with each passing moment. Lieutenant Colonel Williams surveyed the crowd of witnesses and the obvious tension in the room. "I think we need to get a clear understanding of what happened here," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone pay attention. "And I think we need to do it quickly before this situation gets any worse than it already has." The moment Lieutenant Colonel Williams stepped into the courthouse, the entire atmosphere changed. His presence commanded immediate respect from everyone present, civilian and military alike. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and two other military police officers fanned out, their practiced eyes quickly assessing the volatile situation that had taken over the courthouse hallway. Williams was not a man who wasted time on small talk or unnecessary pleasantries. After 22 years in the Navy, including multiple deployments and command positions, he had seen enough chaos to know how to cut through it quickly. His gaze moved from David, still kneeling with his hands visible, to Morrison, who was now standing but looking increasingly uncertain about his position. "Stand down, all weapons," Williams ordered, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people obey without thinking. "Military police have jurisdiction here until we sort out what happened." The civilian officers looked confused and a bit resentful, but they slowly holstered their weapons. Morrison, however, was not ready to give up control of the situation he had created. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a civilian matter. This man assaulted a police officer, and he needs to be arrested by local law enforcement." Williams turned his attention to Morrison, and his expression was not friendly. "Officer Morrison, is it? I understand you've made some serious accusations against one of my men. Before we go any further, I think we need to establish some facts." Rodriguez stepped forward, pulling out his tablet computer. "Staff Sergeant Thompson's service record is exemplary," he announced to the growing crowd. 3 tours in Afghanistan, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and multiple commendations for valor. He's scheduled to speak at the Pentagon next month about counter-terrorism tactics. The crowd erupted in murmurs of appreciation and vindication. The middle-aged woman who had been recording everything held up her phone triumphantly. "I told you Ollie was the real deal. That officer was picking on a genuine American hero." Morrison's face went from red to pale as he realized that his assumptions had been completely wrong. But instead of backing down gracefully, he doubled down on his position. "I don't care what his record says. He attacked me. I have witnesses." "Actually, you don't," called out the businessman who had witnessed the entire encounter. "Every single person here saw you grab him first. You're the one who escalated this situation, and now you're trying to blame him for defending himself." Williams gestured for silence, and the hallway immediately quieted. "I want to hear from witnesses," he announced. "But first, Staff Sergeant Thompson, are you injured?" David slowly stood up, his movements careful and controlled. "No, sir, I'm not injured. Officer Morrison grabbed my arm and tried to force me into an arrest position without probable cause. I defended myself using minimal force, and then he drew his weapon on me." "That's a lie," Morrison protested, but his voice lacked conviction now. The crowd of witnesses was staring at him with obvious disgust, and even some of the civilian officers were looking skeptical about his version of events. The young lawyer who had tried to intervene earlier stepped forward. "Colonel, I'm an attorney, and I witnessed this entire encounter from beginning to end." Officer Morrison approached Staff Sergeant Thompson without provocation, made racist assumptions about his identity and military service, and then became physically aggressive when his accusations were challenged. Williams nodded grimly. "What kind of racist assumptions?" The lawyer looked directly at Morrison as she answered. "He said that real SEALs don't look like Staff Sergeant Thompson. He made comments about you people and suggested that the sergeant came from a ghetto. He also assumed that the sergeant's brother, who has a court hearing today, was involved in drugs or other criminal activity." The courthouse crowd was getting angrier by the minute. People were shaking their heads in disgust and making comments about Morrison's behavior. A young black woman near the back of the crowd spoke up loudly. "So, basically, he saw a black man in military uniform and decided he must be fake. That's exactly the kind of racism we're supposed to be past by now." Morrison was sweating now, realizing that his credibility was being destroyed in front of dozens of witnesses and at least 3 recording devices. "That's not what happened," he insisted weakly. "I was investigating suspicious behavior. It's my job to question people who might be impersonating military personnel." Rodriguez pulled up something on his tablet and showed it to Williams. "Sir, we might want to look at this." Staff Sergeant Thompson was featured in Navy Times last month for his work training new SEAL candidates. His photo and service record are a matter of public record. Williams looked at the tablet, then at Morrison with obvious contempt. "So you're telling me that you accused one of the Navy's most decorated young soldiers of stolen valor, despite the fact that he offered to show you identification and his service record is publicly available?" The security guard who had been watching the situation from the beginning stepped forward. "Sir, I saw the whole thing on our security cameras." Officer Morrison approached the staff sergeant without any justification. The young man was just sitting on a bench waiting for his brother's court hearing. "His brother's court hearing?" Williams asked, looking at David. "Yes, sir," David replied. "My brother Jake is facing minor assault charges from a bar fight, I'm here to speak as a character witness. I've never been in this courthouse before today, and I certainly wasn't doing anything that could be considered suspicious. Morrison was looking desperate now. But he resisted when I tried to arrest him. That's a crime. The elderly man with the cane, who had been watching silently until now, couldn't contain himself any longer. "Young man," he said to Morrison, his voice shaking with anger, "you grabbed that soldier without cause and tried to force him to the ground. Any person with sense would have defended themselves. You're lucky he showed such restraint because, with his training, he could have seriously hurt you if he wanted to." Williams was studying Morrison carefully now, and David could see the colonel's military mind working through the implications of what had happened. This wasn't just about one racist cop anymore. This was about the reputation of law enforcement, the treatment of military personnel, and the very principles that David had sworn to defend. "Officer Morrison," Williams said slowly, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Did you have any evidence beyond your personal assumptions that Staff Sergeant Thompson was impersonating a military officer?" Morrison opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The truth was obvious to everyone present. He had made his accusations based purely on racial prejudice, and now he was trapped by his own bigotry. The courthouse administrator had arrived. During the questioning, along with 2 detectives from Internal Affairs who looked extremely unhappy about the situation, they were being called to investigate. One of them, a middle-aged black woman with sergeant's stripes, was already taking notes and asking witnesses for their contact information. Williams turned to address the crowd of witnesses. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for standing up for what's right today. Staff Sergeant Thompson represents the best of what our military stands for, and your support shows that most Americans understand and appreciate that service." The crowd erupted in applause, with people calling out support for David and expressing their disgust with Morrison's behavior. But Williams wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "I also want everyone to understand that this incident represents a serious breakdown in trust between law enforcement and the military community. Officer Morrison's actions today have damaged relationships that take years to build and maintain." Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear into the marble floor. His supervisor had arrived and was speaking quietly with the Internal Affairs detectives. Other officers were giving him a wide berth, clearly not wanting to be associated with the incident. Rodriguez approached David with a small smile. "How are you holding up, Staff Sergeant?" "I'm okay, Rodriguez," David replied quietly. "Just glad nobody got seriously hurt. For a while there, I thought this was going to end very badly." "It still might," Williams said grimly. "This is going to be all over the news within the hour. The Navy's going to want a full report, and I suspect there are going to be some serious questions asked about training and procedures in this police department." As if to prove his point, the first news van pulled up outside the courthouse, followed quickly by 2 more. Reporters were already setting up cameras on the front steps, and David realized that his quiet morning of supporting his brother had turned into a very public incident that would probably follow him for the rest of his career. But as he looked around at the crowd of people who had stood up for him, who had refused to let injustice prevail simply because it was easier to stay quiet, David felt something that had been missing from his life for a long time: faith in the system he had sworn to protect. The courthouse had become a media circus faster than anyone could have imagined. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes extending skyward like mechanical flowers reaching for the sun. Reporters were setting up cameras on the front steps, and David could see through the tall windows that a crowd was gathering on the sidewalk as word spread through social media about what had happened inside. The investigation was moving quickly. The Internal Affairs Sergeant, Detective Patricia Johnson, had taken charge of interviewing witnesses while her partner worked with courthouse security to review the surveillance footage. Morrison sat slumped on a bench near the elevator, looking like a man who had just watched his career go up in flames. Detective Johnson approached David with a professional but sympathetic expression. "Staff Sergeant Thompson, I'm going to need to get your full statement about what happened here today." I know you've already explained it several times, but I need it on the record. David nodded, still somewhat amazed at how quickly everything had turned around. An hour ago, he'd been staring down the barrel of Morrison's gun, wondering if he was going to become another tragic statistic. Now he was being treated with the respect and courtesy that should have been shown from the very beginning. "Detective, I'll tell you exactly what happened, but I want to make something clear first," David said. "I don't want this to be about me versus all police officers. I've worked with law enforcement many times during my military service, and most officers are good people doing a difficult job. This is about one man who let his prejudices cloud his judgment." Detective Johnson smiled slightly. "I appreciate you saying that, Staff Sergeant. Unfortunately, Officer Morrison's behavior today doesn't represent the values of our department, and we take these situations very seriously." As David gave his statement, the crowd of witnesses was being interviewed by Johnson's partner. One by one, they told the same story. Morrison had approached David without provocation, made racist assumptions about his military service, and escalated the situation through verbal abuse and physical aggression. The middle-aged woman with the phone, who had introduced herself as Carol Bennett, was showing her video to anyone who would look. "I started recording the moment that officer opened his mouth," she explained to a reporter who had somehow gotten inside the courthouse. "I've seen too many stories about police misconduct where there was no evidence. I wasn't going to let that happen here." Her video was already going viral on social media. The hashtag #RespectOurTroops was trending, and people across the country were sharing the footage with comments, ranging from outrage to support for David, military veterans. Organizations were issuing statements condemning Morrison's behavior and praising the witnesses who had stood up for David. Lieutenant Colonel Williams was on his phone with Navy headquarters, providing updates on the situation and coordinating with the Public Affairs Office about how to handle the media attention. David could only hear bits and pieces of the conversation, but it was clear that this incident was being taken seriously at the highest levels of the military. "Sir," Rodriguez said, approaching David during a break in the interviews, "the base commander wants to speak with you when we get back. Nothing disciplinary. He just wants to make sure you're okay and discuss how the Navy should respond to this." David appreciated the support, but he was starting to worry about the broader implications of what had happened. "Rodriguez, I just want to focus on my brother's hearing and get back to normal duties. I never wanted to become the poster child for anything." "I understand that," Rodriguez replied, "but sometimes these things choose us instead of the other way around. The way you handled yourself today, staying calm under pressure and not escalating the violence, that's exactly the kind of professionalism the Navy wants people to see." Across the hallway, Morrison was having a very different conversation with his supervisor, Captain Robert Hayes, even from a distance. David could see that Morrison was getting a stern lecture about his conduct. Other officers who had responded to the scene were being questioned about their own actions, and whether they had followed proper procedures when they arrived. The young lawyer, who had witnessed everything, was now surrounded by reporters outside the courthouse. Through the windows, David could see her gesturing animatedly as she described what she had witnessed. Her statement was being broadcast live on several news channels, and her description of Morrison's racist comments was sparking outrage across social media. "This wasn't just about questioning someone's credentials," she was saying to the cameras. "This was about a police officer who saw a black man in military uniform and immediately assumed he was fake. Officer Morrison made assumptions based purely on race, and when those assumptions were challenged, he became violent and dangerous." David's phone was buzzing constantly with calls and text messages. His parents had seen the news reports and were worried sick. His sister was angry and proud at the same time. Fellow service members from his unit were reaching out to offer support and ask if there was anything they could do to help, but the call that meant the most came from Jake, his brother, who had been told about the incident by his public defender. "David, man, I'm so sorry," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "You came here to help me, and you ended up going through all this because of my problems." "Jake, this isn't your fault," David assured him. "This is about one person's prejudice and bad decisions. Don't you dare blame yourself for what happened. But if I hadn't gotten into that fight, if I hadn't needed you to come to court for me, none of this would have happened, Jake continued. Jake. Listen to me, David said firmly. Sometimes things happen for a reason. Maybe this needed to happen so people could see what's still going on in this country. Maybe those witnesses needed to see that they have the power to stand up for what's right, and maybe that officer needed to face the consequences of his actions before he hurt someone else. Detective Johnson finished her interviews and approached David with a thick folder of witness statements. Staff Sergeant, I've never seen a case with this many cooperative witnesses. Everyone's story matches perfectly, and the security footage confirms everything. Officer Morrison is going to face serious consequences for his actions today. What kind of consequences? David asked. Well, that's up to the district attorney and the police department's disciplinary board, but I can tell you that assault, false imprisonment, and filing false reports are all serious charges. Add in the civil rights violations and the public nature of this incident, and Officer Morrison is looking at the end of his career and possibly criminal charges. The courthouse administrator approached their group, looking stressed but relieved that the situation was finally under control. Staff Sergeant Thompson, I want to personally apologize for what happened in our building today. This is not how we treat any of our visitors, especially not our service members. I appreciate that, David replied. But I hope this leads to some serious conversations about training and procedures. Nobody should have to go through what happened here today. You're absolutely right, the administrator agreed. We're already scheduling meetings with police leadership about protocols for incidents involving military personnel. This can't happen again. As the formal investigation wrapped up, David realized that his brother's hearing had been postponed due to all the commotion. The judge had decided that the courthouse needed to return to normal operations before resuming court business. Jake would have to wait another week for his day in court, but given everything that had happened, that seemed like a minor inconvenience. Lieutenant Colonel Williams gathered his military police team together. Gentlemen, we're going to escort Staff Sergeant Thompson back to base. The media is going to want statements and interviews, and we need to make sure he's protected from any harassment or retaliation. As they prepared to leave, David looked around the courthouse hallway where his life had changed in the span of 2 hours. The witnesses were still talking to reporters and investigators. Morrison was being led away by internal affairs detectives. Security guards were trying to restore normal operations while dealing with the ongoing media presence, but what struck David most was the way ordinary people had stepped up when it mattered. They could have looked away, minded their own business, assumed that the police officer must be right simply because of his uniform and authority. Instead, they had chosen to stand up for justice, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. That gave him hope for the future, both for himself and for the country he had sworn to protect. 3 months later, David stood in the same courthouse hallway where his life had changed forever. This time, though, he wasn't wearing his dress blues. He was in civilian clothes, accompanying Jake to his rescheduled hearing. The atmosphere was completely different now, respectful, calm, and professional. The security guards nodded politely when they recognized him, and the court staff treated both brothers with genuine courtesy. Jake's case had been resolved much more favorably than anyone had expected. The public defender who had initially suggested a plea deal was now working with a team of pro bono lawyers who had volunteered their services after seeing the news coverage. The prosecutor, aware of the media attention surrounding David's family, had agreed to a settlement that involved community service and anger management classes instead of jail time. I still can't believe how different everything is now, Jake whispered as they sat on the same bench where David had waited that morning in August. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Now I'm starting my teaching job next week, and I feel like I have a real future again. David smiled at his younger brother. You always had a real future, Jake. You just needed to learn from your mistakes and move forward. That's what growing up is about. The changes that had followed the incident were more far-reaching than David had ever imagined. Officer Morrison had been fired from the police department and was facing criminal charges for assault. false imprisonment, and violating David's civil rights? The trial was scheduled for next month, and the district attorney had made it clear that they intended to prosecute to the full extent of the law. The police department itself had undergone major reforms. Captain Hayes, Morrison's former supervisor, had implemented new training programs focused on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. All officers were now required to complete cultural sensitivity training, and the department had established a new protocol for handling incidents involving military personnel. More importantly, the department had hired Dr. Angela Washington, a respected psychologist who specialized in police reform, to review their hiring and training practices. Her preliminary report had identified several areas where the department's culture needed to change, and she was working closely with community leaders to implement those changes. David had been invited to speak at several of these training sessions, sharing his experience and helping officers understand how unconscious bias could lead to dangerous situations. It wasn't easy for him. Reliving that morning brought back memories he'd rather forget, but he felt obligated to help prevent similar incidents from happening to others. The hardest part, David had told one group of rookie officers, wasn't the physical confrontation or even having a gun pointed at me. The hardest part was realizing that my uniform, which represents years of service and sacrifice, meant nothing to Officer Morrison because of the color of my skin. That's something we all need to think about. The media attention had been overwhelming at first. David had appeared on several national news programs, always emphasizing that most police officers were good people doing a difficult job. He refused to let his experience be used to paint all law enforcement with the same brush, much to the frustration of some activists who wanted him to take a more aggressive stance. "I'm not interested in being angry," he had told one persistent reporter. "I'm interested in being part of the solution." Officer Morrison made bad choices based on bad assumptions, but that doesn't mean every police officer is like him. The witness, who had recorded the encounter, Carol Bennett, had become something of a local celebrity. Her video had been viewed millions of times, and she had used her newfound platform to advocate for police accountability and bystander intervention. She had started a nonprofit organization called Stand Up and Speak Out that trained citizens on how to safely document police encounters and provide support to victims of police misconduct. David showed us that day what dignity and professionalism look like under pressure, Carol had said during a recent community meeting. But the rest of us showed something important too. That ordinary people have the power to stand up for what's right when they see injustice happening. The young lawyer who had witnessed the incident, Jennifer Martinez, had been promoted to partner at her firm partly based on the national recognition she had received for her advocacy. She was now working on several high-profile civil rights cases and had become a regular commentator on legal news programs. Even the elderly man with the cane, retired teacher Harold Chun, had found a new purpose in his golden years. He had become a volunteer advocate for veterans dealing with the legal system, using his experience and David's story to help other service members navigate bureaucratic challenges. David's military career had continued to flourish despite, or perhaps because of, the incident. He had been promoted to gunnery sergeant and was now serving as an instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center. His experience with crisis management and media relations had made him valuable to Navy leadership, and he was frequently called upon to represent the service at public events. The speech he had given at the Pentagon, which had been scheduled before the courthouse incident, had become one of the most widely circulated presentations in recent Navy history. In it, he had talked about the importance of staying true to your values even when faced with hatred and injustice. The real test of a warrior, he had told the assembled military leaders, isn't how you perform in combat against a foreign enemy. It's how you conduct yourself when confronted with injustice in your own country, among your own people. Do you respond with violence and anger, or do you respond with dignity and strength? Lieutenant Colonel Williams had been promoted to full colonel and was now serving as the military liaison to several police departments around the country. The cooperation between military and civilian law enforcement had improved dramatically as a result of the reforms prompted by David's case. The incident at the courthouse was a wake-up call for all of us. Colonel Williams had testified before a congressional committee studying police reform. It showed us that we can't take for granted that military service members will be treated with respect by civilian authorities. But it also showed us the power of leadership and training to change attitudes and behaviors. Rodriguez had been assigned to work directly with police departments on developing new protocols for military-civilian interactions. His easygoing personality and obvious competence had made him popular with both military personnel and police officers, and he was helping to build bridges between the two communities. As David and Jake waited for their case to be called, David reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning in August. He had never wanted to be a symbol or a spokesman, but he had come to accept that sometimes life puts you in positions where you have to stand for something bigger than yourself. The incident had taught him that racism was far from dead in America, but it had also shown him that most people, when confronted with obvious injustice, would choose to do the right thing. The witnesses who had spoken up for him, the military leadership that had supported him, the media that had told his story fairly, all of them had restored his faith in the system he had sworn to protect. Jake's name was finally called, and the brothers stood up together. As they walked toward the courtroom, David noticed that the hallway was busy with the normal activities of a functioning courthouse: families waiting for hearings, lawyers conferring with clients, security guards maintaining order professionally and respectfully. It looked exactly the way a courthouse should look in a country where justice was supposed to be blind to the color of a person's skin. And while David knew there was still work to be done, still progress to be made, he felt hopeful that the changes sparked by one terrible morning might help ensure that no one else would have to experience what he had gone through. The hearing lasted only 15 minutes. Jake received his community service assignment and his counseling requirements, shook hands with his lawyer, and walked out of the courthouse a free man with a clean slate ahead of him. As the brothers emerged into the afternoon sunshine, David put his arm around Jake's shoulder. "So what's next for you?" Jake smiled, looking more confident and mature than David had seen him in years. "I start teaching on Monday, 3rd grade. I figure if I can handle a classroom full of 8-year-olds, I can handle anything life throws at me." David laughed. "After what we've been through, I think you're probably right about that." They walked down the courthouse steps together, past the spot where news crews had gathered 3 months earlier, past the sidewalk where protesters and supporters had held rallies in the weeks that followed. Now, it was just a quiet street in front of a courthouse where justice had ultimately been served. As they reached David's car, Jake turned to his older brother one more time. "David, I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. Thank you. Not just for coming to court with me, but for handling everything that happened with such class. You made our whole family proud." David started the engine and looked back at the courthouse one final time. "Jake, we all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them and how we treat other people along the way."